Winter has arrived in the Silver Pine Mountains, covering everything in a silent white blanket. For young Ethan, just 8 years old, this landscape seemed to hide ancient and mysterious secrets. When a blue glow draws him into the forest, he embarks on an adventure that will test his courage, reveal the strength of invisible bonds and awaken a unique kind of magic, the connection between man, nature and the unknown. Between the relentless cold and the unbreakable loyalty of a dog called Shadow, Ethan will discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. The first snowflake of winter danced past Ethan's bedroom window, and with it came the familiar whisper of his grandfather's voice, "Winter holds magic for those brave enough to find it." 8-year-old Ethan pressed his nose against the cold glass, his breath creating a small fog circle that expanded and contracted with each exhale. Behind him, Shadow's tail thumped steadily against the hardwood floor, a rhythm that matched the falling snow's gentle descent. "Do you think Grandpa Sam was right about the magic, boy?" Ethan whispered, turning to scratch behind his German shepherd's ears. Shadow's intelligent brown eyes seemed to hold answers to questions Ethan hadn't even thought to ask yet. The dog had been his grandfather's last gift to him, just months before the heart attack that left an empty chair at their dinner table and a hollow space in their home that even Shadow's considerable presence couldn't quite fill. Outside, the mountains of Silver Pine, Colorado, were already disappearing beneath a thick white blanket. The forest behind their house, usually a clear line of pine and aspen trees, was becoming a blur of white and deep green. Ethan loved how the snow changed everything it touched, making the familiar world of his backyard seem like an unexplored territory from one of his grandfather's stories. "Ethan." His mother's voice drifted up from downstairs. "Remember to pack your backpack for tomorrow. First day back after Thanksgiving break." "Okay, Mom," he called back, but his attention remained fixed on the forest's edge. There, between two ancient pines, he thought he saw something move, a flash of blue, perhaps, or maybe just a trick of the light on snow. Shadow's ears perked up too, confirming that Ethan wasn't imagining things. Claire Henderson's footsteps on the stairs barely registered as Ethan leaned closer to the window, trying to catch another glimpse of whatever had caught his eye. His mother appeared in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, reading glasses perched on top of her head where she always forgot them. "Honey, did you hear what I said about?" She stopped, noticing his intense focus on the window. For a moment, she saw his father in his profile, the same determined set of his jaw, the same way of looking at something as if it held all the world's mysteries. The similarity made her chest ache. "What are you looking at?" "I think there's something out there," Ethan said, not turning away from the window. "In the trees." Claire joined him at the window, resting a hand on his shoulder. The forest was still, the snow falling in thick curtains now. "All I see is snow, sweetheart. And it's going to get heavy tonight. The weather service issued a warning." "But Shadow saw it too, didn't you, boy?" Ethan looked at his dog for confirmation, but Shadow had moved to the door, head cocked to one side, listening. Claire squeezed his shoulder gently. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone now. And you need to focus on getting ready for school tomorrow. We're trying to get back to normal, remember?" Normal. Ethan had begun to forget what that word meant. Was normal before Grandpa Sam died? Before Dad? Or was normal something new they were supposed to create, like the snow creating a new world outside? "Can I take Shadow out for just a few minutes?" Ethan asked, turning to his mother with the pleading expression he'd perfected over 8 years of childhood negotiations. "Please. Just to the edge of the yard. He hasn't had his evening walk yet." Claire hesitated, her eyes drifting to the window where the snow was falling faster now, the wind picking up enough to make the old house creak. She'd become more protective since losing her husband 2 years ago, perhaps too protective, as her own mother often pointed out. But Ethan had been so withdrawn lately, spending hours alone in his room with only Shadow for company. At least going outside would be something. 10 minutes, she said finally. Not a minute more. And only to the yard's edge, nowhere near the forest. Promise me, Ethan. I promise, he said quickly, already reaching for his winter coat. Shadow was at his side instantly, tail wagging with renewed enthusiasm. Claire helped him bundle up, wrapping his blue scarf, another of Grandpa Sam's gifts, securely around his neck. 10 minutes, she repeated, but Ethan was already heading downstairs, Shadow close at his heels. As the back door closed behind them, Claire watched from the window as her son and his faithful companion ventured into the swirling snow. Something about the scene made her uneasy, the way the forest seemed to loom closer in the growing darkness, how the wind had picked up so suddenly. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, remembering another winter night when she'd watched someone she loved disappear into a snowstorm. Please, she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to, keep him safe. But the snow was falling too thick now, and within moments Ethan and Shadow were little more than shadows themselves, moving through a world that was quickly turning white and wild and dangerous. The snow crunched beneath Ethan's boots as he made his way across the backyard, each step leaving a perfect impression in the fresh powder. Shadow bounded ahead, his black coat already dusted with white, making him look like a cookies and cream ice cream cone. The wind had died down momentarily, and in its absence, the world felt muffled, as if someone had wrapped everything in cotton. That's when Ethan saw it again, the flash of blue between the trees. This time, he was sure it wasn't his imagination. It looked almost like a butterfly, which made no sense in the middle of winter, but Grandpa Sam always said the most magical things rarely made sense. Look, Shadow. Ethan pointed toward the tree-line. The German shepherd's ears pricked forward, his posture alert but not alarmed. If anything, he seemed curious, his head tilting slightly as he studied the forest's edge. Ethan glanced back at the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see his mother moving around, probably starting dinner preparations. She'd be occupied for at least a few minutes. The mysterious blue light flickered again, deeper in the forest this time, like it was beckoning him forward. We'll just take a quick look, Ethan whispered to Shadow, his breath forming little clouds in the frigid air. Mom won't even know we went past the yard. Shadow whined softly, looking between Ethan and the house, as if he understood they were about to break a promise. But when Ethan took his first step toward the forest, the loyal dog followed, staying close to his young master's side. The transition from yard to forest was subtle. One moment they were in open space, and the next, the trees had closed around them like silent guardians. The snow was lighter here, caught in the branches above, creating a strange twilight world of shadows and crystalline sparkles. Ethan's boots left deep impressions in the unmarked snow, and Shadow's paw prints followed alongside, creating a trail that led back to safety. The blue light appeared again, always just ahead, always just out of reach. It reminded Ethan of the fireflies he and Grandpa Sam used to catch in mason jars during summer evenings. His grandfather would always insist on releasing them before bedtime, saying, "Some kinds of magic need to stay free, kiddo." "It's probably just around these trees," Ethan muttered, more to convince himself than Shadow. The dog's behavior had changed, he was no longer curious but watchful, staying closer to Ethan's side, occasionally looking back the way they had come. The wind picked up again, stronger now that they were away from the house's protection. It whipped through the trees with a hollow whistling sound that made Ethan think of ghost stories. The snow was falling faster too, thick flakes that seemed to dance and swirl with purpose, as if they were trying to tell him something. Shadow barked suddenly, a sharp, warning sound that made Ethan jump. The blue light had vanished, and when Ethan turned to look back, he realized with a sinking feeling that their tracks were already disappearing under fresh snow. The forest looked different from this angle, all the trees identical in their winter coating. "Maybe we should go back," Ethan said, his voice small against the growing wind. Shadow barked again, more urgently this time, and pushed against Ethan's legs, trying to herd him in what the dog clearly thought was the right direction. But then the blue light appeared once more, closer than ever before. In that brief moment of illumination, Ethan thought he saw a face in its glow, kind eyes, a gentle smile that reminded him of Grandpa Sam. Without thinking, he took 3 quick steps toward it, reaching out as if he could catch it like a firefly. The ground shifted beneath his feet. Later, Ethan would remember this moment in fragments, the sensation of falling, Shadow's frantic barking, the world turning white then dark then white again as he tumbled down what felt like an endless slope. Snow filled his mouth, his eyes, his nose. He was rolling, sliding, unable to tell up from down, until finally, impact. The landing knocked the wind from his lungs. For several terrifying seconds, Ethan couldn't breathe at all. When he finally managed to gasp in air, it was sharp with cold and panic. He tried to sit up, but his right leg exploded with pain, forcing him back down into the snow. Above him, Shadow's barking echoed from somewhere he couldn't see. The slope he'd fallen down rose like a white wall, too steep to climb, especially now that his leg hurt so badly. The blue light was gone, and with it, any trace of magic or wonder. Reality crashed in like the approaching darkness. He was lost, injured, and the snow was falling harder than ever. "Shadow!" Ethan called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Shadow, help!" The German shepherd's barking grew more frantic, and Ethan could hear scrabbling sounds as the dog tried to find a way down the treacherous slope. But the snow was too loose, the incline too steep. Each time Shadow attempted to descend, mini avalanches of powder snow cascaded down, forcing him to retreat. "Go get Mom!" Ethan shouted, remembering every movie he'd ever seen where the loyal dog ran for help. "Shadow, go home! Get Mom!" For a moment, the barking stopped. Ethan imagined Shadow standing at the top of the slope, torn between his instinct to stay with his boy and the command to seek help. Then the barking resumed, more determined than ever. Shadow wasn't leaving. The wind howled through the trees, and Ethan realized he was shivering violently. His wet clothes were already starting to freeze, and the pain in his leg made it hard to think. The forest was growing darker by the minute, and the snow was falling so thick now that he could barely see the top of the slope where Shadow's barks seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Grandpa Sam's voice drifted through his memory, "Winter holds magic for those brave enough to find it." But right now, Ethan didn't feel brave at all. He felt small and scared and desperately sorry he'd broken his promise to his mother. As the cold began to seep deeper into his bones, Ethan did the only thing he could think to do. He began to build a snow shelter like his grandfather had taught him, all while praying that Shadow would understand what needed to be done. Shadow's howls echoed through the darkening forest as he paced the edge of the slope, his powerful muscles tense with frustration. Below, he could smell Ethan's fear mixing with the metallic scent of blood, not much, but enough to spike the dog's protective instincts into overdrive. Every fiber of his being screamed to stay, to find a way down, to protect his boy. But another instinct, deeper and more primal, told him that staying would mean watching Ethan freeze to death. The snow was falling faster now, and Shadow could sense the temperature dropping dangerously. He'd been bred for cold weather, but Ethan was another story. The boy's scent was already changing, taking on the sharp edge of hypothermia that Shadow recognized from his search and rescue training with Grandpa Sam. With one final, mournful howl, Shadow made his decision. He turned and bolted through the forest, his powerful legs carrying him through the deepening snow. He had to find help, and quickly. Down in the hollow created by his fall, Ethan was fighting his own battle against time and cold. His grandfather's voice seemed to float around him as he worked. "The key to survival is keeping your head, kiddo. Panic is a luxury you can't afford in the wilderness." With trembling hands, Ethan packed snow into blocks, just as Grandpa Sam had shown him during their winter camping trips. His right leg throbbed whenever he moved, but he forced himself to continue. The shelter wouldn't be pretty, but it only needed to keep him alive. First rule of winter survival, Ethan muttered through chattering teeth, reciting his grandfather's lessons. "Stay dry if you can, get dry if you can't." He pulled off his outer layer of snow-soaked clothes, wincing as the movement jostled his injured leg. His thermal underwear was still relatively dry, and he had his grandfather's scarf, which had somehow stayed wrapped around his neck during the fall. The wind howled overhead, but down in his hollow, Ethan was partially protected. He worked methodically, ignoring the growing darkness and the way his fingers were starting to lose feeling. The snow shelter slowly took shape, a crude dome just big enough for him to crawl into. He used his arms as measuring tools, just like Grandpa Sam taught him. Your arm span is about your height, kiddo. Nature gave you all the measuring tools you need. Back at the house, Claire was starting to worry. The 10 minutes she'd allowed had stretched to 15, then 20. She went to the back door, peering out into the gathering storm. "Ethan," she called, her voice almost immediately swallowed by the wind. "Shadow." When no answer came, she grabbed her coat and boots, forcing down the panic rising in her throat. This wasn't like the night she lost David. This wasn't the same. She wouldn't lose anyone else to these mountains. She was halfway across the yard when she heard it, Shadow's bark, different from any sound she'd ever heard him make. The German shepherd burst from the tree lean, snow coating his dark fur. The moment he saw Claire, he started barking frantically, running a few steps back toward the forest before returning to her, then repeating the pattern. "Where's Ethan?" Claire's voice cracked as she realized her son wasn't with his dog. "Shadow, where is he?" Shadow barked again, more urgently, then grabbed the sleeve of her coat with gentle but insistent teeth, trying to pull her toward the forest. Claire's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. She knew what this meant, she'd seen Shadow do this in training exercises with David. The dog was trying to lead her to something. To someone. "Oh God," she whispered, then turned and ran back to the house. Shadow followed, whining anxiously as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "Emergency services, what's your situation?" "My son," Claire managed, already heading back outside with a flashlight and emergency kit. "My 8-year-old son is missing in Silver Pine Forest, behind 1425, Mountain View Road. Please, we need search and rescue. He's been gone at least 20 minutes, and the storm is getting worse." In his snow shelter, Ethan had finally finished the basic structure. He crawled inside, tucking his grandfather's scarf around his face to conserve warmth. The small space was already warmer than outside, protected from the wind and insulated by the snow. But the cold had settled deep in his bones, and his injured leg was a constant throb of pain. "Second rule of winter survival," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Conserve energy and stay awake." He started doing what Grandpa Sam had taught him, flexing his muscles one group at a time, from his toes up to his face, generating what heat he could. The blue light he'd followed seemed like a dream now, or maybe a nightmare. Had he really seen a face in it? Had it really reminded him of Grandpa Sam? In the darkness of his shelter, doubt crept in like the cold, making him question everything. Shadow's distant howls had stopped, and Ethan tried to convince himself this was good news, it meant his dog was getting help. But the silence that replaced those howls was deafening, broken only by the muffled sound of wind over snow and the increasingly sluggish beating of his own heart. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry, Shadow." He touched the scarf around his neck, thinking of his grandfather. "I'll try to be brave, Grandpa Sam. I promise I'll try." Above the forest, the storm continued to intensify, erasing tracks and obscuring paths. Somewhere in the white chaos, Shadow was leading Claire and the first responders toward his young master, while Ethan huddled in his shelter, fighting to stay awake and warm. The night was just beginning, and for both boy and dog, it would be the longest of their lives. Red and blue lights pulsed against the falling snow, turning the white landscape into a surreal disco of emergency colors. Claire watched as search and rescue teams gathered in her backyard, their voices tight with urgency as they checked equipment and discussed search patterns. Shadow paced anxiously between the teams, his dark eyes fixed on the forest's edge, waiting. Officer Reeves, a veteran of mountain rescue with gray at his temples and lines of experience around his eyes, approached Claire with a map. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to know exactly where Shadow led you. Every detail matters." Claire's fingers traced the paper, leaving slight tremors in their wake. "He came from this direction," she said, pointing to a section of the forest. "But the snow's covered any tracks by now." "That's why Shadow is our best chance," Reeves said, nodding toward the German Shepherd. "Dogs like him are worth more than all our high-tech equipment in conditions like these. We'll split into 3 teams, and Shadow will lead the primary search." A young rescue worker approached with a small plastic bag containing one of Ethan's shirts. "For the other dogs," she explained. "Though from what you've told us about Shadow's training, he won't need it." Claire watched as Shadow's attention snapped to the shirt, his nose twitching. David had spent countless hours training him for search and rescue, though he'd never been officially certified. Now, those training sessions might save their son's life. Temperatures dropping fast, someone called out. "We're looking at -15 with the wind chill within the hour." Claire's heart clenched. Somewhere in that vast whiteness, her little boy was alone in the cold. She thought of David, of how he'd always said the mountains demanded respect. "They're not malicious," he'd told her once, "but they're not forgiving either." Deep in the forest, Ethan was learning this truth firsthand. Inside his snow shelter, the initial feeling of accomplishment had faded, replaced by a bone-deep cold that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. He'd managed to create a small breathing hole, remembering his grandfather's warning about carbon dioxide buildup, but each breath of frigid air felt like swallowing ice. "Third rule of winter survival," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Keep your mind active." He tried to focus on happy memories, summer afternoons with Grandpa Sam teaching him to fish, Mom's pancakes on Sunday mornings, Dad teaching Shadow new tricks in the backyard. But the memories seemed to slip away like smoke, replaced by an overwhelming urge to sleep. A sudden sound outside his shelter made Ethan's heart jump. Something was moving in the snow nearby, something large. His mind raced with possibilities: bear, mountain lion, wolf. He held his breath, listening to the crunch of snow under heavy paws. The animal circled his shelter once, twice, then stopped near the entrance. Ethan could hear it breathing, could almost feel its presence through the packed snow walls. Then came a sound that made his blood freeze, the low, rumbling growl of a wolf. In the search area, Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears pricking forward. The rescue team behind him halted, watching as the German Shepherd's posture changed from searching to alert. A low growl built in his throat. "He's got something," Officer Reeves said, signaling the other teams with his radio. Shadow's picked up a scent. But Claire noticed something in Shadow's behavior that the others missed. The dog wasn't just alert, he was anxious. She'd seen this posture before, when Shadow sensed danger. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Shadow looked back at the humans, then at the forest, then back again. His whine was almost human in its frustration. He could smell Ethan, yes, but he could smell something else too, something that made his protective instincts surge. In his shelter, Ethan was trying to remember everything his father had ever told him about wolves. They were typically afraid of humans, right? But would they be more aggressive in winter, when food was scarce? The growling outside had stopped, replaced by the sound of sniffing. Then, to Ethan's complete surprise, he heard a soft whimper, not aggressive, but almost questioning. The wolf was trying to figure him out, just as he was trying to figure out the wolf. "Please," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the wolf or to whatever higher power might be listening, "I just want to go home." The wolf moved again, and suddenly moonlight flooded the shelter as its nose pushed through the entrance. Ethan caught a glimpse of silver fur and amber eyes. The wolf was enormous, its face scarred from old battles, but its expression wasn't hostile. If anything, it seemed curious. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Ethan noticed that the wolf favored its right front paw, holding it slightly off the ground. Somehow, this detail made the creature seem less frightening. It was injured, like him. The wolf withdrew its head, and Ethan heard it moving around the shelter again. Then, to his amazement, he felt warmth as the wolf lay down against the outer wall of his snow cave, its body heat seeping through the packed snow. Shadow, meanwhile, had made his decision. With a sharp bark that commanded attention, he took off through the snow, forcing the search team to follow. Claire ran with them, her heart pounding. She didn't know what Shadow had sensed, but she knew time was running out. The forest was a maze of white and shadow, but Shadow moved with purpose, weaving between trees and over fallen logs. The searchers' lights bounced off the snow, creating a disorienting strobe effect, but Claire kept her eyes fixed on Shadow's dark form ahead. "Please be okay," she prayed as she ran. "Please be alive." In his shelter, Ethan found himself oddly comforted by the wolf's presence. The small space was noticeably warmer, and the sound of another living creature's breathing helped keep his mind from wandering into darker thoughts. "Thank you," he whispered to his unexpected guardian. The wolf's only response was to press closer against the shelter wall. Somewhere in the distance, Ethan thought he heard barking, but he couldn't be sure if it was real or just another trick of his increasingly foggy mind. His eyes felt heavy, and despite all his grandfather's warnings about staying awake, he found himself drifting. The last thing he was aware of was the wolf's rumbling breath and a familiar voice in his memory: "Winter holds magic for those brave enough to find it." The wolf's head snapped up at the sound of approaching barks, its muscles tensing against the snow shelter's wall. Inside, Ethan had drifted into a dangerous twilight state, his consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind. The cold had become almost comfortable now, a deceptive peace that Grandpa Sam had warned him about during their winter survival lessons. "That's when it's most dangerous, kiddo," his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When the cold starts feeling warm, that's your body giving up the fight." Shadow's barks grew closer, carrying a note of desperate determination that cut through the howling wind. The search team struggled to keep pace with the German Shepherd as he bounded through snow drifts, his nose leading him unerringly toward his young master's scent. But there was something else in the air now, a wild, musky smell that made his hackles rise. Claire watched as Shadow suddenly slowed his pace, his body language changing from urgent search to cautious approach. Officer Reeves noticed it too, raising his hand to signal the team to move carefully. "Something's up ahead," he whispered, his flashlight beam cutting through the swirling snow. Shadow sensing another animal. The wolf stood now, moving away from Ethan's shelter with fluid grace despite its injured paw. It positioned itself between the approaching search party and the snow dome, its breath creating ghostly clouds in the freezing air. This was its territory, and it had already claimed the boy as something to protect. Shadow emerged into the small clearing first, his dark form materializing from the curtain of snow like a shadow-given substance. He froze when he saw the wolf, their eyes meeting across the white expanse. The size difference between them was striking. The wolf easily outweighed Shadow by 40 pounds, its winter coat making it appear even larger. For a moment, neither animal moved. The wolf's amber eyes studied Shadow with ancient wisdom, while Shadow's brown eyes held all the loyalty and determination that generations of domestication had bred into his bloodline. Both were guardians, but of different worlds that had suddenly collided in this snow-swept clearing. "Dear God," Claire gasped as she emerged behind Shadow, catching sight of the wolf. Officer Reeves immediately moved in front of her, his hand going to his sidearm. "Don't," Claire said quickly, grabbing his arm. Something in the scene before them made her pause. The wolf wasn't showing aggression, and Shadow, despite his obvious tension, wasn't attacking. "Something's not right here. Look at how they're behaving." Shadow took a tentative step forward, his ears pricked forward in cautious curiosity. The wolf's ears flicked in response, and its posture shifted slightly, less defensive, more assessing. Then, in a moment that seemed to defy everything the search team knew about wild animals, the wolf limped aside, revealing the snow shelter behind it. There. One of the rescue workers spotted the dome-like structure. That's a survival shelter. Shadow needed no further invitation. He bounded forward, circling the shelter and whining urgently. The wolf backed away, maintaining a cautious distance but showing no aggression. It was as if, having confirmed that help had arrived, it was relinquishing its temporary guardianship. Claire ran to the shelter, her heart in her throat. "Ethan? Honey, can you hear me?" There was no response from inside the snow dome. The rescue team moved with practiced efficiency, carefully widening the entrance while checking for structural stability. When they finally created an opening large enough to reach inside, Claire's breath caught at the sight of her son. Ethan was curled into a tight ball, his grandfather's scarf still wrapped around his face. His skin had taken on a frightening pallor, with patches of red on his cheeks and nose indicating the early stages of frostbite. His breathing was shallow and slow, too slow. "He's hypothermic," the team medic announced, already pulling out thermal blankets. "We need to get him out of here now, but we have to move him very carefully. Any rough movement could send his heart into arrhythmia." As they worked to extract Ethan from the shelter, Shadow paced anxiously nearby, whining softly. The wolf watched from the edge of the clearing, its amber eyes reflecting the rescue team's flashlights. There was something almost human in its gaze, a depth of understanding that made Claire wonder if her father-in-law had been right about the magic that existed in these mountains. "Mom." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper as they lifted him onto the rescue stretcher, but to Claire, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. "I'm here, baby," she choked out, gripping his cold hand. "I'm right here." The wolf. Ethan's eyes fluttered, struggling to focus. It helped, like in Grandpa's stories. Shadow moved to the stretcher, gently nuzzling Ethan's hand before turning to look at the wolf. For a brief moment, the domestic dog and wild wolf regarded each other again, no longer as potential adversaries but as fellow guardians who had each played their part in keeping the boy alive. Then the wolf melted away into the swirling snow, leaving only tracks that were quickly disappearing under fresh powder. The rescue team began their careful journey back through the forest, carrying their precious cargo. Shadow walked beside the stretcher, his body occasionally brushing against Claire's leg as if to reassure her that everything would be okay. As they made their way out of the forest, Ethan drifted between consciousness and dreams, the lines blurring between reality and his grandfather's tales of mountain magic. The last thing he remembered before giving in to exhaustion was the feeling of Shadow's warm breath on his hand and his mother's tears falling like snowflakes against his skin. The steady beep of hospital monitors created a rhythm that matched the snow still falling outside the window. Claire sat in the uncomfortable chair beside Ethan's bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm between the various tubes and sensors. Shadow lay at the foot of the bed, the hospital staff having made an exception to their usual no-dogs policy after Officer Reeves explained the German Shepherd's role in the rescue. Ethan's face had regained some of its color, though the frostbite on his cheeks and nose still painted angry red patches across his skin. His right leg, now properly set and casted, rested elevated on a pillow. The doctors had assured Claire that he would make a full recovery, but the words, "lucky to be alive," kept echoing in her mind. "Mrs. Henderson." A gentle voice drew her attention to the door, where Dr. Winters stood with her tablet. "Can we talk for a moment?" Claire nodded, giving Ethan's arm a gentle squeeze before following the doctor into the hallway. Shadow lifted his head, eyes tracking her movement, but remained dutifully by Ethan's side. "His core temperature is nearly back to normal," Dr. Winters began, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "The frostbite is superficial, no lasting damage there. The leg fracture was clean, and kids heal quickly. Physically, he's going to be fine." Claire heard the unspoken, but hanging in the air. "And emotionally? That's what I wanted to discuss." Dr. Winters glanced through the window at Ethan's sleeping form. Events like this can be traumatic, especially for children. But sometimes they can also be transformative. Has he talked about what happened out there? Claire wrapped her arms around herself, remembering Ethan's fevered whispers about the wolf. He keeps mentioning a wolf that protected him. The rescue team said they saw it too, but... She shook her head. It seems impossible. Wolves don't behave that way. Maybe not usually, Dr. Winters said thoughtfully. But I've worked in mountain hospitals for 20 years, Mrs. Henderson. I've heard stories that defy explanation. Sometimes, when we're at our most vulnerable, nature has its own way of showing mercy. Inside the room, Ethan began to stir. Shadow immediately sat up, his tail thumping softly against the bed as the boy's eyes fluttered open. Mom. Ethan's voice was stronger now, though still rough from the cold he'd endured. Claire hurried back to his side, Dr. Winters following more slowly. I'm here, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Tired. Ethan's hand found Shadow's fur, fingers tangling in the thick coat. Is the wolf okay? I'm sure it is, Claire assured him, though her eyes met Dr. Winters over Ethan's head. The doctor gave a slight nod, encouraging her to let Ethan talk about his experience. It was hurt, Ethan continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. It's paw, but it still stayed with me. Like it knew I was hurt too. His eyes suddenly filled with tears. It was like Grandpa's stories, Mom. About the mountain magic. Do you think maybe Grandpa sent it? Claire's throat tightened. She thought of her father-in-law, of all the tales he used to tell about the mountains having their own consciousness, their own way of protecting those who respected them. She'd always assumed they were just stories meant to entertain a grandson, but now. Your grandfather loved you very much, she said carefully. And he taught you how to survive out there. The snow shelter you built, that was from his lessons, wasn't it? Ethan nodded, pride briefly replacing the exhaustion on his face. He said the mountains would provide if you knew how to look. His expression crumpled suddenly. I'm sorry, Mom. I broke my promise. I went into the forest even though you said not to. Oh, honey. Claire gathered him into her arms, mindful of the 4 lines. Yes, you broke your promise, and we'll talk about that. But you also remembered your training. You kept your head. You survived. Her voice broke on the last word, all the fear and relief she'd been holding back finally spilling over. Shadow whined softly, pressing closer to both of them. The dog's presence reminded Claire of David, how he'd insisted on getting a German Shepherd specifically for search and rescue training, how he'd spent countless hours working with Shadow, as if he'd somehow known the dog would one day need those skills. Your dad would be so proud, she whispered into Ethan's hair. Of both of you. She reached out to include Shadow in their embrace. Dr. Winters quietly excused herself, leaving the family to their moment of healing. Outside the window, the snow had finally stopped falling, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. Ethan had drifted back to sleep, but this time his face was peaceful, one hand still resting in Shadow's fur while the other held his mother's. Claire watched him breathe, each steady rise and fall of his chest a gift she would never take for granted again. The mountains outside the window loomed large and majestic in the clearing weather. Claire thought of the wolf out there somewhere, perhaps tending to its own injured paw. She thought of David, of Sam, of all the love that still surrounded them even after loss. Maybe there was magic in these mountains after all, not the kind found in storybooks, but the kind that lived in the connections between hearts, in the wisdom passed down through generations, in the loyalty of a dog and the mercy of a wolf. Thank you, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking Shadow, the wolf, the mountains themselves, or the spirits of the men who had prepared them all for this moment. Perhaps she was thanking them all. The crunch of tires on snow announced their arrival home after 5 days in the hospital. Claire guided her SUV carefully into the driveway, noting how different everything looked. The forest behind their house, once a source of simple beauty, now seemed to hold both danger and wonder in its snow-laden branches. In the back seat, Ethan pressed his face against the window, his eyes fixed on the tree line where his adventure had begun. Shadow sat beside him, as he had throughout the hospital stay, the dog's presence a constant comfort during the long hours of recovery. Now, as Claire helped Ethan maneuver out of the car with his crutches, Shadow stayed close, matching his pace perfectly as if he'd been trained for this specific task. "Careful on the steps," Claire cautioned, holding the front door open. The local news had covered Ethan's story, dubbing it the Christmas Mountain Miracle, and their porch showed evidence of the community's concern: casseroles in disposable containers, get-well cards, even a handmade blanket from Mrs. Rodriguez next door. Inside, the house felt different too. Claire had always kept David's presence alive through photographs and mementos, but now she noticed Ethan studying his father's images with new understanding. He paused in front of a particular photo, David and Shadow in their search and rescue training gear, both looking proud and capable. "Dad knew, didn't he?" Ethan said quietly, balancing on his crutches. "That's why he trained Shadow so hard. He knew the mountains could be dangerous." Claire set down the bag of medications and supplies from the hospital. "Your father respected the mountains," she said carefully. "He always said they were neither good nor bad, they just were. The key was being prepared." Ethan nodded, his face thoughtful. The experience had changed him in subtle ways that went beyond the healing frostbite marks and the cast on his leg. There was a new maturity in his eyes, a deeper understanding of consequences and courage. "Can you teach me more?" he asked suddenly. "About survival stuff, I mean. Not to go into the forest alone again," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "But to be prepared, like Dad was. Like Grandpa Sam taught me." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were different from the desperate tears she'd shed during the search. These were tears of recognition, of seeing her son begin to transform his fear into wisdom, his mistake into motivation. "We'll learn together," she promised, running her hand through his hair. "But right now, you need to rest. Doctor's orders." They settled Ethan on the living room couch, Shadow immediately claiming his spot at the boy's feet. Claire brought over a mug of hot chocolate, a special treat they'd been denied during the hospital stay, and tucked a blanket around them both. "Mom." Ethan's voice was hesitant. "Do you think the wolf is okay?" Claire sat beside him, choosing her words carefully. "Officer Reeves said they've been tracking it. They've seen prints in the snow, it's still out there, still hunting. Animals are incredibly resilient, honey. Just like you." "I dream about it sometimes," Ethan admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "But not scary dreams. It's like it's watching over me. Like Grandpa Sam used to say, the mountains watch over people who respect them." Through the window, the afternoon sun caught the snow-covered branches of the forest, making them sparkle. Claire remembered how she'd once found these mountains overwhelming, how David had gradually taught her to see their beauty alongside their power. Now, watching Ethan's thoughtful face as he gazed out at the same view, she realized her son was learning that lesson in his own way. Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking forward as he stared intently out the window. Both Claire and Ethan followed his gaze, and for a moment, Claire thought she saw a flash of movement among the trees, a shadow that might have been a wolf, might have been a trick of light on snow. "The news people keep calling it a miracle," Ethan said softly, "but it wasn't really, was it? The wolf, Shadow, the things Grandpa Sam taught me, they were all already there. I just had to be brave enough to trust them." Claire pulled him closer, careful of his injured leg. "That's a very wise way to look at it," she said, thinking how much he sounded like his father in that moment. "Sometimes the real miracles aren't the mysterious things that happen to us, but the strength we find in ourselves and others when we need it most." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the winter light paint long shadows across the snow. Shadow eventually dozed off, but his ears remained alert, twitching at every sound from outside. The dog's protective instinct, Claire realized, had been transformed by their ordeal just as Ethan's fear was being transformed into respect. Later that evening, as Claire prepared dinner, she heard Ethan's voice from the living room. He was telling Shadow a story, not about his accident, but about the wolf, about the magic he'd found in those dark hours alone in the snow. His voice held none of the trauma the doctors had warned might surface. Instead, there was wonder, and a growing understanding of his place in the wild world beyond their backyard. She paused in the doorway, watching her son gesture animatedly despite his injuries, Shadow's head tilted in apparent fascination. The scene reminded her so strongly of David sharing his mountain stories that her heart ached, not with the sharp pain of loss this time, but with the bittersweet recognition that her husband's legacy lived on in their son. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the winter sky, their light reflecting off the snow. Somewhere in the vastness of the mountain forest, a wolf with an injured paw might be looking at those same stars. Claire sent up a silent prayer of gratitude, for Shadow's loyalty, for her son's survival, for the mysterious ways in which the mountains had chosen to protect rather than harm. They were changed, all of them, by what had happened. But as Claire watched Ethan laugh at Shadow's attentive expression, she knew they were changed for the better, stronger, wiser, and more aware of the thin line between civilization and wilderness, between ordinary life and the magic that sometimes broke through when you needed it most. 2 weeks after returning home, Ethan sat at the kitchen table surrounded by books about wilderness survival, his cast-covered leg propped on a chair. Shadow dozed nearby, but his ears perked up at every movement from his young master. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the frost patterns that decorated the glass like delicate lace. "Mom," Ethan called out, his finger marking a place in one of the books, "did you know that wolves actually help maintain healthy forest ecosystems? They keep deer populations in check, which helps prevent overgrazing." He paused, then added more quietly, "like how my wolf helped maintain my ecosystem that night." Claire looked up from where she was preparing lunch, struck by the maturity in his observation. The past 2 weeks had seen a remarkable transformation in her son. The quiet, somewhat timid boy who'd ventured into the forest that fateful day was being replaced by someone more thoughtful, more confident, someone who reminded her increasingly of David. "Officer Reeves stopped by the station yesterday," she said, bringing him a sandwich and sitting down across the table. "He wanted to show me something." She pulled out her phone and pulled up a photo. It showed a set of wolf tracks in fresh snow, and beside them, unmistakably, was a stick arranged in an arrow pattern pointing toward a small cave. "They found this near where you were rescued," Claire explained. "The rangers say wolves don't make patterns like this. They think the wolf was trying to communicate with the search teams." Ethan studied the photo intently, his eyes bright with understanding. "It was returning the favor," he said simply. "I shared my shelter with it, and it tried to help others find me." Claire felt a familiar tightness in her throat, the one that came whenever she thought too deeply about how close she'd come to losing him. But there was something else there now too, pride in how he was processing the experience, turning it into wisdom rather than trauma. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about your request to learn more survival skills." She pulled another item from beside her chair, a familiar worn leather case that made Ethan's eyes widen. "Dad's compass," he breathed. "And his field guides," Claire added, placing them on the table. "He would want you to have them now." "But," she held up a hand as Ethan reached for them, "we're going to do this right. I've signed us both up for wilderness training courses with the Mountain Recreation Center. You, me, and Shadow, we'll learn together." Ethan's face lit up, but there was understanding in his expression too. "As a family," he said. "Like how Dad would have wanted." "Exactly." Claire opened the compass case, revealing the scratched but still perfectly functional instrument inside. "Your father always said that the most important survival tool isn't something you can carry, it's knowledge. And knowledge is safer when it's shared." Shadow padded over to rest his head on Ethan's lap, sensing the emotional weight of the moment. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears, his other hand carefully tracing the compass's edge. "I've been writing about it," he said suddenly. "About what happened. Not just the scary parts, but the magical parts too. About the wolf, and Shadow, and how Grandpa Sam's lessons saved my life." He looked up at Claire. "Do you think other kids might want to read it? Maybe it could help them understand the mountains better." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Your grandfather always said that stories are how we pass wisdom down through generations." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "But maybe we could write it together. I have a feeling this story belongs to all of us." Through the window, the forest stood peaceful in its winter cloak. A chickadee landed on the bird feeder, sending a small shower of snow to the ground. Shadow watched it with mild interest, but remained loyally by Ethan's side. "Mom." Ethan's voice was thoughtful. "Do you think the wolf knows we're grateful for what it did?" Claire considered this. "I think some things go beyond human understanding. That wolf chose to help you for its own reasons. Maybe it recognized something in you, the same thing that made Shadow such a devoted protector." She smiled. "Your father used to say that animals can sense the truth about people better than we can ourselves." Ethan nodded, returning to his books with renewed purpose. Claire watched him for a moment, marveling at how their tragedy had somehow transformed into something else, not just a story of survival, but a journey of growth for both of them. Later that afternoon, as the winter sun began its early descent, Claire found Ethan asleep on the couch. One of David's field guides lay open on his chest, and Shadow maintained his usual protective position at his feet. On the coffee table, she noticed a notebook filled with Ethan's careful handwriting. The title at the top of the page read, "The Winter Wolf, A Story of Mountain Magic." She sat quietly in the adjoining armchair, watching her son sleep peacefully. The forest outside their window was turning blue with approaching dusk, and for a moment, she thought she glimpsed a familiar silhouette moving between the trees, a wolf, perhaps, making its evening rounds. But this time, the sight didn't fill her with fear. Instead, she felt a deep sense of connection to this wild place they called home, to the mountains that had both endangered and saved her son, to the mysterious ways in which nature sometimes reached across the divide to touch human lives. Shadow lifted his head and met her eyes, his gaze somehow knowing. In that moment, Claire understood that their story wasn't just about survival or even about the bond between a boy and his dog. It was about finding the courage to embrace life's mysteries, to learn from its challenges, and to recognize the magic that existed not just in mountain forests, but in the healing power of love, trust, and understanding. The Mountain Recreation Center buzzed with activity as families gathered for the weekend wilderness training course. Ethan sat in his wheelchair, a temporary necessity until his cast came off next week, with Shadow alert beside him. Claire checked them in at the front desk while Ethan watched other participants arrive, their breath creating clouds in the crisp morning air. "Henderson family?" A familiar voice made them both look up. Officer Reeves stood there, dressed in casual ranger gear rather than his search and rescue uniform. "I'll be one of your instructors today." He smiled warmly at Ethan. "Thought you might like to learn from someone who knows these mountains inside and out." As they moved into the main room, Ethan noticed a large topographical map on the wall. His eyes immediately found the area where he'd been lost, now marked with a small red pin. Other pins dotted the map in various colors, each representing different wildlife sightings and rescue operations. "Before we start," Officer Reeves said, pulling up a chair to join them, "there's something I thought you should see." He pulled out a tablet, bringing up a series of wildlife camera images. "These are from our tracking stations in the area where we found you." The first few photos showed typical winter wildlife, deer, elk, the occasional moose. Then came an image that made Ethan lean forward eagerly. There was the wolf, its silver coat unmistakable in the infrared lighting. Its injured paw was clearly visible, held slightly off the ground. "We've been monitoring this wolf for almost 3 years," Officer Reeves explained, swiping to older images. "She's quite remarkable. Lost her pack in a territorial dispute, but instead of joining another group, she's carved out her own territory. And here's the interesting part, we've documented several instances of unusual behavior." The next photos showed the wolf leading an injured moose calf back to its mother, standing guard over a fallen eagle until rangers could rescue it, and most surprisingly, leaving small game at the edge of camping areas during particularly harsh winter nights. "Some of us call her the Guardian," Officer Reeves said softly. "It's not typical wolf behavior, but then again, she's not a typical wolf. We think her injury might have changed her perspective somehow, made her more empathetic to other injured creatures." Claire watched her son's face as he absorbed this information. "So when she found Ethan, she was doing what she's done before, protecting someone vulnerable." Officer Reeves smiled. "Though this was the first time she's actively helped with a human rescue." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of learning, knot tying, map reading, weather prediction. Despite his wheelchair, Ethan participated enthusiastically in every activity he could manage. Claire noticed how he approached each lesson with careful attention, taking notes in a small notebook just like David used to do. During the lunch break, Officer Reeves shared more stories about the guardian wolf. "The interesting thing is," he said, spreading out a detailed map of wolf territories, "she's established a kind of partnership with local authorities. When we find her tracks or signs, we pay attention. She's led us to injured wildlife, dangerous trail conditions, even lost hikers, though none as young as you, Ethan." "Do you think she remembers?" Ethan asked, absently scratching Shadow's ears. "That night, I mean." "Animals remember kindness," Officer Reeves replied thoughtfully. "And fear. They remember those who treat them with respect." He glanced at Shadow. "Your dog certainly remembers. Notice how he's been watching the forest edge all morning." Sure enough, Shadow's attention had been divided between protecting Ethan and monitoring the tree line visible through the center's large windows. It was as if he sensed they were talking about his wild counterpart. As the afternoon session began, focusing on wilderness first aid, Claire found herself growing emotional watching Ethan engage with the material. He asked intelligent questions about handling different types of injuries, paying special attention to the sections about helping injured animals safely. "You know," she overheard him telling another participant during a break, "sometimes the mountains choose to help you, but you have to show them respect first. My grandpa taught me that, and now I know it's true." Later, as they were packing up to leave, Officer Reeves pulled Claire aside while Ethan was engrossed in examining a display of animal tracks. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "The night we found Ethan, when Shadow led us to that clearing, we found wolf tracks circling the entire area, not just from that night, but from the previous day too. The Guardian had been patrolling, keeping other predators away. She wasn't just sharing body heat through the shelter wall, she was actively protecting your son." Claire felt tears welling up. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because tomorrow's forecast calls for the first clear night since the rescue. And every full moon, like clockwork, the Guardian makes her rounds past that same clearing." Officer Reeves handed her a small envelope. "These are coordinates for the wildlife observation blind nearby. If you wanted to say thank you, well, that might be the place to do it." On the drive home, Ethan was unusually quiet, processing everything he'd learned. Shadow sat in the back with him, still alternating his attention between his young master and the passing forest. "Mom." Ethan finally broke the silence as they turned onto their street. "I think I know what I want to do when I grow up." "What's that, honey?" "I want to work with Officer Reeves. Help protect the mountains, teach people about them. Maybe." He hesitated, then continued more confidently, "maybe even study wolves. Especially wolves who choose to be guardians." Claire caught his eye in the rearview mirror, seeing in his expression the same passion that had driven David to these mountains, the same wisdom that had filled Sam's stories. Her son was finding his path, guided by an experience that could have broken him but had instead helped him grow. As they pulled into their driveway, the setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Tomorrow would be a full moon, and somewhere in these ancient mountains, a silver wolf with an injured paw would make her rounds, continuing her self-appointed role as guardian of all creatures who needed help. Claire touched the envelope in her pocket, already knowing they would be making a special trip tomorrow night. Some thank yous needed to be said in person, even if that person happened to be a wolf. The full moon painted the snow-covered forest in shades of silver and blue as Claire helped Ethan settle into the wildlife observation blind. Shadow sat quietly between them, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the narrow windows. The small structure, carefully positioned on a ridge overlooking the clearing where Ethan had been found, offered protection from the winter wind while allowing them to observe without being seen. "Remember what Officer Reeves said," Claire whispered, adjusting the infrared binoculars. "We need to stay absolutely quiet. No sudden movements." Ethan nodded, his face serious with concentration. His cast-covered leg was propped carefully on a cushioned stool, but he barely seemed to notice any discomfort. His attention was focused entirely on the moonlit clearing below, where his snow shelter had once stood. The night was alive with subtle sounds, the soft hoot of a great horned owl, the distant crack of ice-laden branches, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Shadow's ears moved constantly, tracking each noise, but he maintained his position between Ethan and Claire, ever the faithful guardian. As midnight approached, a change came over the forest. The owl fell silent. The small creatures that had been rustling in the underbrush grew still. Shadow's posture shifted subtly, his muscles tensing as he stared intently through the observation window. Then they saw her. The guardian wolf emerged from the tree like a spirit materializing from Shadow. Her silver coat gleamed in the moonlight, making her appear almost ethereal. She moved with grace despite her injured paw, which she still held slightly off the ground. Even from their elevated position, they could see the intelligence in her amber eyes as she surveyed the clearing. Ethan's hand found Claire's in the darkness, squeezing tightly. Neither spoke, afraid to break the magic of the moment. Shadow watched the wolf with intense focus, but showed no sign of aggression. If anything, his posture suggested recognition. The wolf paused in the center of the clearing, lifting her nose to scent the wind. For a heart-stopping moment, she turned her head directly toward their blind, and Claire could have sworn those ancient eyes met hers through the darkness. Then something extraordinary happened. The wolf limped deliberately to the exact spot where Ethan's snow shelter had been. She circled the area 3 times, nose to the ground, following a pattern that seemed too precise to be random. When she finished, she sat back on her haunches and lifted her head to the moon. The howl that followed was unlike anything Claire had ever heard. It wasn't a hunting cry or a territorial call, it was something else entirely, something that made her think of ancient languages and forgotten songs. Shadow's ears pricked forward, and he let out a soft whine. "She's singing," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Like in Grandpa's stories about the old wolves who could talk to the moon. As if in response to his words, the wolf turned again toward their blind. This time, there was no doubt, she knew exactly where they were. She rose slowly and, to their amazement, began moving toward the ridge where the blind was positioned. Claire felt her heart rate increase, but not from fear. There was something deliberate about the wolf's approach, something that spoke of purpose rather than threat. Shadow remained calm beside them, watching his wild counterpart with what almost looked like respect. The wolf stopped about 20 feet from the blind, close enough that they could see every detail of her face in the moonlight. She was older than Claire had initially thought, with gray starting to show around her muzzle. Battle scars marked her face and shoulders, telling stories of a hard life survived through cunning and strength. But it was her eyes that held Claire's attention, they were filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Slowly, deliberately, the wolf lowered her head in what could only be described as a bow. She held the position for a long moment, then raised her head and met their gaze again. The message was unmistakable, an acknowledgement of their shared experience, a recognition of the bond forged that desperate night in the snow. Ethan moved carefully to the window, placing his hand against the glass. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of all the words that couldn't be said. The wolf's ears twitched forward at the sound of his voice. She took one step closer, then another, until she stood directly below the window. In the moonlight, they could see that her injured paw was healing well, though it would likely never be quite the same, a permanent reminder of her own brush with vulnerability. For several heartbeats, they remained locked in this tableau, the boy who had survived the winter night, the mother who had almost lost everything, the loyal dog who had brought help, and the wild wolf who had chosen to be a guardian. The moment seemed to stretch beyond time, beyond the ordinary boundaries between human and wild. Then, with the same deliberate grace with which she had appeared, the wolf turned and began making her way back toward the forest. At the edge of the clearing, she paused for one final look back. The moonlight caught her form, creating a silver halo around her fur, and for a moment, Claire was reminded of all the stories Sam used to tell about spirit animals and mountain magic. The wolf melted back into the forest shadows, but her presence lingered in the clearing like a remembered dream. Shadow let out a soft sigh and settled closer to Ethan, who was still staring at the spot where the wolf had disappeared. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I understand now what Grandpa Sam meant about the mountains having their own kind of magic. It's not like in fairy tales, it's something older, something real." Claire wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders, feeling the truth of his words deep in her heart. "Sometimes," she said, "the most magical things are the ones we can't fully explain, like a wolf who chooses to be kind, or a dog who knows exactly what to do in a crisis, or a little boy who remembers his grandfather's lessons just when he needs them most." They stayed in the blind until moonset, watching the forest return to its normal rhythms. The owl resumed its hunting, small creatures emerged from hiding, and the wind continued its endless dance through the trees. But something had changed, not in the forest itself, but in their understanding of it. As they prepared to leave, Claire noticed Ethan placing something on the small shelf below the observation window, a carefully folded paper wolf he had made during his hospital stay. A thank you gift, left where the guardian would surely find it on her next patrol. Some stories, Claire realized, didn't need endings because they were part of something larger and more continuous, like the cycles of the moon, the changing of seasons, or the ancient dance between wilderness and civilization. Their encounter with the guardian wolf hadn't ended with Ethan's rescue, it had merely opened a new chapter in their ongoing relationship with these mountains they called home. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint as Ethan sat waiting for the doctor to remove his cast. Shadow lay at his feet, occasionally nudging the soon-to-be-removed plaster with his nose as if encouraging it to hurry up and free his young master. Claire sat beside them, thumbing through a well-worn copy of Ethan's story notebook, now filled with detailed accounts of their moonlit encounter with the guardian wolf. "Ready to get back on your feet?" Dr. Winters asked cheerfully as she entered the room, carrying the cast removal tools. "I hear you've got big plans." Ethan nodded eagerly. "Officer Reeves is letting me help with the Junior Ranger program next weekend. We're going to teach kids about wildlife safety and tracking." The mechanical whir of the cast saw filled the room, but Ethan barely noticed his nervousness about the procedure. His mind was too full of the presentation he prepared about responsible wilderness interaction, complete with his own experience as a prime example of what not to do, and how to survive if things went wrong. As the cast fell away, revealing his pale, slightly shrunken leg, Ethan felt a sudden rush of emotion. This leg had been broken when he fell, had been warmed by a wolf's body heat, had carried him home to safety. Now it was ready to carry him forward into whatever came next. "Take it slow," Dr. Winters cautioned as she helped him stand. "Your muscles need time to rebuild their strength." Shadow immediately pressed against Ethan's left side, providing silent support as the boy took his first unassisted steps in weeks. Claire watched with tears in her eyes, remembering another first steps moment many years ago, and wishing David could see their son now. "Look what came for you," Dr. Winters said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "The Wildlife Center asked me to give it to you." Inside was an official-looking certificate naming Ethan as an honorary junior wildlife ranger, along with an invitation to join their youth conservation program. But it was the photograph beneath these documents that made both Ethan and Claire catch their breath. The image, clearly taken from one of the wildlife cameras, showed the guardian wolf approaching the observation blind where they'd left Ethan's paper wolf. In her mouth was the carefully folded origami creation, and somehow, even in the grainy nighttime photo, her expression seemed gentle, almost reverent. "Officer Reeves thought you'd want to see that," Dr. Winters said softly. "She took it about 3 days after your visit. They've never seen her interact with human-made objects like that before." Later that afternoon, Ethan stood at the edge of their backyard, Shadow beside him as always. The forest stretched before them, no longer a source of fear but a place of respect and wonder. His leg felt strange, stronger than he'd expected but still uncertain, like it was relearning its place in the world. "Ready?" Claire asked, adjusting the straps of her daypack. They had planned this moment carefully, Ethan's first short hike since the accident, accompanied by both his mother and Shadow, staying on marked trails with a ranger-monitored GPS tracker. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the crisp mountain air fill his lungs. The forest seemed to welcome them, the late winter sunlight filtering through the branches like a benediction. As they started down the trail, he found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before: wolf tracks crossing deer tracks, the subtle signs of rabbit burrows, the way certain branches bent to indicate prevailing winds. They hadn't gone far when Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears pricking forward. There, in a patch of snow beneath a pine tree, they found a perfect print, larger than a normal wolf's, with a slight irregularity in the right front paw. Beside it, miraculously preserved in the shade-protected snow, lay Ethan's paper wolf. Claire watched as her son carefully picked up the origami creation. It was unmarked by teeth or claws, as if it had been placed there with deliberate gentleness. The guardian had left them a message of her own. "She's welcoming me back," Ethan said softly, understanding flowing through him like warm sunshine. "But on different terms this time. As a friend who respects the forest, not just a lost boy who needed help." They continued their hike, moving slowly but steadily along the trail. Ethan used his father's compass to practice navigation, marked wildlife signs in his notebook, and shared his growing knowledge with his mother. Shadow ranged ahead occasionally but always returned, his role shifting from protector to partner in exploration. Near the end of their planned route, they reached a small clearing with a perfect view of the mountains. The same peaks that had seemed so threatening during the search now stood majestic and serene against the blue winter sky. Claire spread out a blanket, and they sat together, sharing hot chocolate from a thermos. "You know," Ethan said, watching an eagle soar overhead, "I think this is what Dad and Grandpa Sam wanted all along, for us to really know these mountains, not just live near them." Claire smiled, seeing in her son's face the same quiet wisdom that had marked both his father and grandfather. "They would be so proud of how you've grown through this experience. Not just surviving it, but learning from it, using it to help others." Shadow suddenly lifted his head, and they heard it, a distant wolf howl, echoing off the mountainsides. It was answered by another, then another, until the air was filled with wild harmony. But among these voices, they recognized one distinct call, deeper, more melodic, carrying a note of ancient wisdom. The guardian was singing again, but this time her song didn't speak of protection or survival. Instead, it seemed to celebrate something larger, the eternal dance between wild and tame, the delicate balance of respect and freedom, the deep magic that lived in every mountain shadow and forest glen. As they packed up to head home, Ethan took one last look at the peaks around them. He was no longer the same boy who had chased a mysterious blue light into danger. He was becoming something else, someone who understood that the greatest adventures weren't about conquering the wilderness, but about learning to live in harmony with it. Shadow pressed against his leg, and Ethan scratched his faithful friend's ears. Together, they had all found their place in this mountain world, not as intruders or observers, but as part of its ongoing story. And somewhere in the vast forest around them, a silver wolf with an injured paw continued her own chosen path, guarding the delicate balance between two worlds. Spring came early to Silver Pine that year, melting the snow in gentle stages and waking the forest with tender green buds. 1 year to the day after Ethan's rescue, he stood before a group of elementary school students at the Mountain Recreation Center, Shadow sitting proudly at his side. The wall behind him displayed his published story, The Winter Wolf, its cover featuring a beautiful illustration of a silver wolf standing guard over a snow shelter. The mountains aren't just a place, Ethan told his young audience, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned this truth firsthand. They're alive in their own way, and they remember how we treat them. My grandfather taught me that, but I didn't really understand until the night I got lost, and found, in these forests. Claire watched from the back of the room, her heart full as she observed her son sharing his experience. The past year had transformed him in remarkable ways. The quiet, unsure boy had blossomed into a passionate advocate for wildlife conservation and wilderness safety. His story had not only become a local bestseller but had been adopted by schools across Colorado as part of their outdoor education curriculum. Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared, Ethan continued, echoing words his grandfather had once told him. It means you respect the things that scare you and learn how to face them wisely. He gestured to Shadow. Sometimes you need help to be brave, and that help can come from unexpected places, like a loyal dog, or even a wild wolf who chooses to be kind. After the presentation, Officer Reeves approached them with a tablet in hand. Thought you'd want to see this, he said, pulling up a recent wildlife camera image. Taken last week in the North Valley. The photo showed the guardian wolf leading 2 younger wolves through deep snow, teaching them to navigate the difficult terrain. Her injured paw had healed as well as could be expected, and though she still favored it slightly, she moved with the same grace they remembered from that moonlit night at the observation blind. She's adopted them, Officer Reeves explained. Young dispersers from different packs, both injured or struggling. She's teaching them her ways, passing on her unique approach to these mountains. Ethan studied the image with bright eyes. She's building her own kind of pack, he said softly. Like how we built our own kind of family. Claire wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, understanding exactly what he meant. Their family had grown too, not just with the closer bond between them, but with the extended family of rangers, wildlife officers, and mountain community members who had become part of their lives. Later that afternoon, they made their way up to Grandpa Sam's favorite viewpoint. The hiking trail was clear of snow now, marked with the first wildflowers of spring. Shadow ranged ahead of them, occasionally stopping to wait, forever balancing his protective instincts with their new spirit of adventure. At the summit, Claire helped Ethan set up the small memorial they had brought, a weather-resistant copy of his book, protected in a clear case, with a simple plaque, in memory of David and Sam Henderson, who taught us to respect these mountains, and in honor of a wild wolf who showed us their magic. As they sat enjoying the view, a familiar howl echoed across the valley. The guardian's voice was unmistakable, and now it was joined by her adopted pack members, creating a harmony that seemed to bridge the gap between wild and tame, past and present, loss and renewal. Listen, Ethan said, closing his eyes to focus on the song. They're not just howling, they're telling a story. Shadow sat alert beside him, ears forward, as if he too understood the deeper meaning in those wild voices. Claire watched her son's face in the warm spring sunlight, seeing echoes of David's strength and Sam's wisdom in his expression. The mountains had tested him, but they had also blessed him with a gift far greater than survival. They had shown him his place in the great web of life that connected all things. The guardian's howl faded into silence, but its echo seemed to linger in the clear mountain air. Shadow gently nosed Ethan's hand, and together they began their journey back down the trail. They no longer needed to leave origami wolves or wait in observation blinds for signs of their wild friend. She was part of their story now, as they were part of hers. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold, Ethan paused to make one last journal entry. Claire glimpsed the words as he wrote them: "Some kinds of magic don't need to be seen to be believed. They live in the hearts of loyal dogs and wild wolves, in the wisdom of mountains and the love of family, in the courage to face our fears and the wisdom to learn from them. Grandpa Sam was right, winter holds magic for those brave enough to find it. But now I know that every season holds its own magic, if we just learn how to look." Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, and they all turned to see a familiar silver form watching them from a distant ridge. The guardian wolf stood like a statue against the darkening sky, her two young companions beside her. For a moment, time seemed to stop as wild and tame, past and present, love and loss all merged into one perfect understanding. Then the wolves melted away into the gathering dusk, leaving only their tracks in the soft earth and their song in the mountain air. But Ethan and Claire knew they weren't really gone. Like David and Sam's love, like the magic of these mountains, like the courage that lived in every heart brave enough to face its fears, some things remained forever, unseen but undeniably present, guiding those who knew how to follow their trail. As they made their final turn toward home, Shadow walking steadily between them, Ethan and Claire shared a smile of perfect understanding. Their story, like the Guardians, would continue to evolve, touching other lives, teaching other hearts, adding its own small thread to the eternal tapestry of mountain magic that had watched over them all on that winter night that seemed so long ago.